Okay, friends and colleagues, welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy Perrin. I'm a professor of sociology here at UNC Chapel Hill and the director of the best place on campus, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. Welcome to IAH's Zoom Talk series. This is one of the ways we're working to keep the good conversations going, the intellectual life on campus going strong, even in the context of the COVID pandemic. We're thrilled that you were able to join us today for today's conversation. I want to talk briefly about some housekeeping rules and etiquette for the call before I go on to introduce today's speaker. In order to try our best to reproduce the spirit of community, the feeling of conversation that we strive to maintain, we ask that if you're able to, please leave your camera on for the course of the conversation. Please, however, of course, leave your microphone muted unless and until you're called upon to be part of the conversation during the latter part of the event. Also, when we do finish the presentation and we move to the question and answer and comment section, we would love for you to be involved in any possible way. You're welcome either to ask to join, to be called upon by using the raise hand feature of Zoom, or alternatively to post a question or simply a request to be recognized in the group chat. And I will make sure that we get to as many questions and comments as we possibly can during the conversation. This is the last of our currently scheduled IAH Zoom talks. So keep watching for the next round of them. We have some folks we're working to schedule now, and I think we'll continue some great conversations. As with the rest of our IAH Zoom talks, the recording of this conversation will be edited lightly and then posted to our IAH website in the coming weeks. Before we begin with the introductions, I just want to recognize and thank the fantastic IAH team who are in the background working to organize and make sure that the system works well. Ebony Johnson, our events coordinator, Sophia Ramos, our communications director, Ava Lane, our administrative coordinator, and Tommy Watson, our executive director, are all working in the background today to make sure the call works really well. I am thrilled today to get to introduce really one of the most exciting intellectuals working today, who's agreed to come and talk to us on the topic Society After Pandemic. Dr. Alondra Nelson is currently a professor, the Harold F. Lindner Professor to be specific, at the Institute for Advanced Study, having spent quite a lot of her career prior to that, including as Dean for Social Sciences at Columbia University. She's also the president of, I think, one of the most interesting organizations around, the Social Science Research Council, which really sits on the border, in my view, between the humanities and the social sciences, and funds the most sort of cutting edge, unusual, forward-looking kinds of research and inquiry right in that important space. Dr. Alondra Nelson is a graduate of the University of California at San Diego and earned her PhD from New York University. And she's one of those folks, whenever something pops up on my Twitter feed, I go immediately to read it if it's from her, because it's always interesting, unusual, and really insightful. She's written a good number of books, most recently a book I love called The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. And much of her work sits in this fascinating space between science and knowledge, medicine, healthcare, and race, equity, and justice. She's also the editor of, a while ago now, of a really influential, important special issue of Social Text called Afrofuturism, which outlined a series of sort of, again, provocative ideas that resonated and continue to resonate to this day. I'm thrilled to welcome now Dr. Alondra Nelson for her presentation called Society After Pandemic, and I look forward to the presentation and to the conversation afterwards. Welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that introduction and for the chance to speak with all of you this afternoon. Thank you for being here. Those of you who are in Chapel Hill, I know that you've had a complicated start to the start of the term. And so I hope that things are smoothing out into kind of the new abnormal that is life. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some, new ideas with you and the half an hour or so I've been given to make a few remarks. So I'll get started, and this is fairly conversational, and as you'll see. So in April, I wrote a short essay launching the Social Science Research Council's COVID-19 and the Social Sciences Initiative. The URL for that is all one word, covid19research.ssrc.org, which includes rapid research grants, a series of essay verticals around COVID-19 and democracy and religion and media. Essay kind of launched this kind of virtual research center that we pulled together in April. And I wrote it as this essay, Society After Pandemic, as I lived in the New York metropolitan area during the height of the pandemic. And as I was reflecting on the kind of rapid transformations to social life that were happening all around me, that were really being manifest in just a few weeks' time. I mean, those of us who were overscheduled, 3 months of scheduling kind of just disappeared from the calendar. Things closing down immediately, things we never thought could close and the like. I mean, I think we'll all be indelibly marked by this moment, I think, for the rest of our lives, and we'll have stories about these kind of rapid transformations. But for me, as someone who's also a scholar and also sits at this research nonprofit, the Social Science Research Council, I was also left with a kind of series of questions about what we were doing as scholars, as thinkers, and what we were doing wrong. And it really got me, beginning with this essay and what I think will be a book of essays, to begin thinking about how do we rethink social life and social research, how we do our work and how we think about our world, kind of in reaction to and in response to this moment. Which is to say that I think some of our prevailing theories and concepts of society and social life are, may be inadequate, and they may have always been inadequate or have been inadequate for a long time, and that this moment, I think, offers us an opportunity to really revisit some of those. COVID-19 has become a kind of social kaleidoscope that is reflecting and refracting social phenomena and reassembling them in both new and familiar formations with a kind of vividness that is I think new for all of us. And so the question that I've been interested in, one of them is how do the social conditions exposed, exacerbated, and created by the novel coronavirus ask of us to revisit and rethink ideas about society, about social institutions, about social categories, and about technology, and ultimately, I think, about politics. And this really, this conversation for me really emerges out of a kind of deep frustration, as I said, with the inadequacy of the kind of social explanations we had for what was taking place around us. And, as I described in the essay, but won't go into here, things like, economic models, sort of historical precedent, all of that really fell to the wayside. None of it worked. None of it was inadequate. It was, this moment has been kind of off the scale, beyond the scale of so much that we've tried to sort of model and think through. And so partly my frustration, I think, is because we're living in a moment that is truly unprecedented in so many ways and for so many reasons, having to do with everything from governance to politics to culture. But it's also, I think, frustrating for me because I think that we need kind of new visions and new heuristics and new analytics for thinking about this moment. And so what I kind of humbly offer this afternoon are really more gestures than conclusions and more questions than answers. And I'm going to take this up in kind of three categories, or three, I think, undergirding myths that I think that we've been kind of we've had to face in this moment, and then offer gesturally some kind of new ways that we might try to think about these things. And so the three sort of categories that I want to think about are on the one, the myth of social stasis and racial progress. Secondly, the fallacy of enduring social categories and the emergence of new ones. And lastly, the myth of solutionism, which I borrow, of course, from Evgeny Morozov, and the reality of a kind of technological patchwork surveillance. So part of what this time, Corona time, as some of us have come to describe it, has illuminated is really the kind of incompleteness, the failure, the wrong-headedness of so much that we took for granted in the world. And this time has also illuminated the kind of urgency and dire stakes, already urgent and dire for many of us and many of our communities, of the profound inequality in both general terms and also, you know, the kind of why, if you think of the Thomas Piketty kind of global inequality terms, but also the sort of profound and indeed perverse racial inequality, structural discrimination, and anti-Black racism in particular that's been manifest in the United States for centuries. So to begin, let me say something about the myth of social stasis and racial progress. I mean, one of the, I guess the sort of things that I think was most surprising and shocking to us with the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic, with the renewal of the movement for Black lives in this particular moment, was, I think, a sense that sort of things should be at status quo, or that there should be a kind of social equilibrium. And really kind of appended to that, and an adjunct to that, has been a kind of narrative of racial progress, this sort of idea that in the United States, that life has only been getting better, that, you know, the sort of founded, you know, prevailing myth of racial liberalism, that, you know, from the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act through the Obama administration, we've had this kind of inevitable kind of progress to racial progress, an inevitable stride to racial progress on a kind of social foundation that was kind of static and stable. So I want to offer that, you know, that this kind of stable temporality and stable progress, of course, is not the world that we live in. It is not the world at all. And moreover, that you know, there's increasingly, I think, good tools for us to think about a really kind of critical engagement of the kind of what Victor Ray and Louise Seamster called the progress paradigm, and I'll say a little bit about a paper that they published in 2018, and to then use this critical opportunity as a way to, I think, construct a new theories of society. So Victor Ray and Louise Seamster in 2018 wrote a paper in sociological theory called Against Teleology and the Study of Race and Ethnicity Towards the Abolition of the Progress Narrative. And here in this work, they argue that this narrative, it really rests upon what they call, quote, untenable teleological assumptions founded in Enlightenment discourse. And so I won't rehearse their whole kind of stunning conversation here. It's very rich, but it is a kind of tour de force, you know, journey through theories of the Enlightenment that really sort of show how ideas about the biologization of race and about science as being the sort of purest form of truth kind of together created this kind of teleological narrative, and moreover, and always sort of bound together such that, you know, in their words again, that racism was gradually diminishing as Western society was modernizing, you know, often modernizing through science and technology, right? And that this modernization was a kind of an enlightenment, not in just a scientific sense, but a kind of moral enlightenment, that we understood, you know, our sort of past failings around racism and race, and that we're kind of ever moving forward. But of course, recent experimental research, empirical research by Jennifer Richeson's lab at Yale, you know, and I'm thinking in particular on a paper that she did with Michael Kraus and Ifeoma Onya-Endor in 2019 in the journal Perspectives of Psychological Science. And this paper is really, sort of empirical, experimental evidence using various kinds of experimental surveys, really that sort of gives the lie to the kind of enduring mythology of American racial progress. So they began the essay, that this article, the very first line says, quote, "Despite America's tumultuous racial history, Americans generally believe the nation has made steady, consistent progress towards achieving racial equality." So that's the first sentence. And I would want to add to that, so too have many scholars, right? So that this Americans category means that a lot of the ways that we do social science, public health, humanities research actually implicitly, even though scholars often know better, right, about the world around us, that we're making kind of implicitly this assumption. So they do this empirical research, and part of what they conclude is that what they call "quote unquote" motivated cognition is what for them really is underlying these this sort of willful kind of ignorance, these kind of misperceptions about, in the case of their experiments, about economic inequality, race-based economic inequality in particular. And they suggest that the motivation is, the one hand, about an understandable desire to sort of uphold this sort of ideology of American sort of fairness and meritocracy. And there's obviously now some great work coming out about critical work about meritocracy, including the philosopher Michael Sandel's new book. And they argue that, second, that this motivation is really about the sort of visibility of high status, Black and brown people, like Barack Obama, right? That sort of are used to kind of give the lie to the larger problem of not only profound, but sort of actively rising and increasing racial inequality. So I want to kind of pull so just that was what I feel like is the kind of one of the problems facing us, that kind of mythology, and that if we had, as a society, as scholars, as students, variously had that in mind, that critical approach to the racial progress narrative in mind, that some of the things that were catalyzed by the arrival of this coronavirus in our lives should not have been surprising to us. So for me, not only the frustration with our lack of explanatory power, but I think the sort of sense of a loss of innocence or surprise with the profound racial and class inequality that sort of accompanied the novel coronavirus. And so, one of the ways I tried to deal with that, this is just a bit of a tangent, was that I started this crowdsourced coronavirus syllabus early on, like in March, I think around March 15th, because it was clear that that we shouldn't be surprised, because we'd had generations of research from other pandemics, from other moments of kind of external shock to societies in which a similar pattern happened, that communities were, marginalized communities were further marginalized, stigmatized communities were further stigmatized, and the like. So there were some kind of context we could get from prior history, prior social science work, prior, humanistic work more generally, but there were things that were particular to this moment as well that require us, I think, to, as I said, kind of go back to the drawing board and kind of not sort of reinvent the wheel, but like really sort of, I think, go back to some foundational principles. So pulling a thread out of the fruitful Victor Ray and Louise Seamster paper with which I began, one of how they sort of end this theoretical paper is to sort of offer that we might have different foundational accounts of society, right? That we might have kind of a new account of beginnings that take seriously slavery, dispossession, colonialism, settler colonialism in particular, and really sort of places it at the center of our work. So what would it mean to be honest about that sort of history and take that as the starting point, not the active denial or agnotology or kind of willful ignorance about that history as something to be gotten over as we sort of move toward sort of perfecting theories of society. So they one of the solutions that they offer, a different account that they offer, is they pull from the medical sociologists Bruce Link and Joe Phelan, who have this important paper and then subsequent research agenda on the fundamental causes of disease, and offer that as pulling it out of medical sociology specifically and offering it as a kind of way writ large, this fundamental cause driver for thinking about society. So this would help us potentially to move beyond linear notions of progress, because it is about fundamental causes that are sort of segmented in society, but that are also actively, dynamically changing. So it is about some stability and some change, and the sort of toggle between the two and the impact of that toggle in people's lives. So I want to suggest that that in this moment, following the fundamental cause suggestion from Ray and Seamster, that society after a pandemic is for us appreciating society as a causal variable of illness, and we might think about Arlene Geronimus's work on weathering, work that we know on environmental justice and pollution, lack of access to social welfare, heightened exposure to the pandemic, to the virus itself, general kind of forms of vulnerability that are really social and deeply social, both and their origins. So I want to suggest that with this kind of first myth that I think that we need to work around, the one about sort of social stasis and racial progress, that we really need a gimlet-eyed and honest accounting of inequality and of dispossession, of racial slavery, as the starting point for any account of society. So, and that we don't, and of course that we cannot presume a kind of progressive teleology, but rather we want a new temporality. So I've been quite intrigued by the philosopher Charles Mills, published earlier this year from a lecture that he had given on what's called the chronopolitics of racial time. And so he offers that part of what we need to do to get out of this kind of this sort of myth of racial progress is to sort of literally reset the clock of how we think, how and when and where society, temporality space of when and where society kind of begins. And he suggests, this is a quote from him, resetting the Eurochronometer. So it's akin a little bit to Seamster and Ray in the idea of really sort of going back to the Enlightenment narrative that we tell ourselves about racial progress and sort of reworking that and resetting that. And so what would it mean to tell a theory of society that begins, in North America before colonialism? These are just kind of thought exercises. What would it mean to tell a theory of society, that begins before the imperial exercise and the colonial encounter, and to sort of ponder and consider that. At the same time, what does it mean to begin a theory of society that takes the sort of conflict and power play and degradation of colonialism and slavery as a starting point, an honest starting point as well. So I've returned. I've been thinking a lot again about. I've been thinking about Marx, and believe it or not, Andy will get a chuckle out of this, and about his sort of classic work, classic work on conflict theory, which is so, is supposed to be so central to the work that we do as scholars and as social scientists. But I think a couple of things happen. That conflict theory for Marx, of course, is about class inequality, and it's about class struggle, of course. Rightly, I think, critiqued in this moment for not, Pache, Adolf Reed, not helping us to understand kind of racial inequality as well. But I think that we have really failed to sort of live out what it would mean in our work as epidemiologists, as sociologists, as humanities scholars, and as, citizens, as residents of New York, New Jersey, and the like, North Carolina, to really think about conflict as the everyday, as the lived experience of everyday life, not the extraordinary, not the aberration, but what we're living in every day. And I think that that offers for us, you know, it's a less rosy way of thinking about what society is, but I think that it's a truer way, and one that is more honest, and one that would not have left us, I think, in such a state of sort of psychic and also social freefall around the sort of quick transformations that happen. So on the one hand, and this is again to think about the sort of stasis and the change, quick transformations that happen after the arrival of COVID-19, but also, and this is Amiri Baraka, the changing same, all of the things that we could have anticipated, right, that were going to happen. And we were somewhat surprised by both of those. And I'm actually kind of curious to sort of continue to think through why that was the case. So, so for me, this means that the assumption of society after pandemic must be to assume, but not accept, right? But to assume, but not accept labor exploitation, medical experimentation, health inequality, mass incarceration, like fully accept those as givens, truisms of society, even as we are challenging, abolishing, you know, intervening in what they are. These are not aberrations of society. These are society, social institutions from which we must begin to do the work, in which we must begin to do the work of transformation. And, you know, seeking, you know, that if there's going to be stasis, that stasis should be, you know, maybe utopian or aspirational, right? That as a kind of resolution of conflict, even as we know that society will never not have power struggles and never not have conflict, you know, so seeking a kind of stasis, even as we know it can never be fully achieved. The groundswell of attention to systemic and structural racism, I think, is for example, that we're having as a society in the US and to some extent globally, is one way of having a new starting point for what American society is, right? And staring that squarely in the face. And I think, you know, why I mean, there's lots of political and ideological reasons why a kind of concept of society that really centers white supremacy and anti-Black racism makes people uncomfortable. It's intended to do so. But it really is, I think, about being honest about conflict theory and about the fact that it is sustained and it continues to be sustained, and that struggles over power and indeed over freedom and thriving continue as well. So I'll move now to the second sort of category of things I wanted to talk about, which is the fallacy of enduring social categories and the emergence of new ones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I've been thinking about new social categories for a while. So Andy mentioned my book, The Social Life of DNA, which came out in 2016 and was an ethnographic project mostly about consumers of direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing, indeed the early consumers in the United States. And one of the things that became clear through this project was the emergence of new kinship categories. So very early on, people in the genealogical communities that I spent time with started to use categories like DNA cousin, you know, genetic cousin, DNA sister, and the like, always with the qualifier of DNA or genetic in front of sister, brother, cousin, relative, etc. And I thought that the qualifier was telling, because it was suggesting to me that this was a category of kinship that was new and was emergent. They didn't think to themselves, you know, otherwise they would have just said, this is my cousin. So if you're a person who just thinks genealogy is true and whether or not this cousin is, you know, a second cousin or a 22nd cousin, that we're all just cousins, that the qualifier, I think, wouldn't have been necessary in the same way. So I was continued to be curious about that in my work. And of course, there's work about new socialities, new way of thinking about being in community together, and the sort of work in the world of science, sociology of science and medicine, and indeed race that I work in, you know, a lot of that is the kind of intellectual genealogy of that is traced to Paul Rabinow's work on biosociality, which is, you know, kind of biological bases for new forms of community, in his case, around rare disease, but I think, you know, the category's been really exploded and applies to a lot of other things. So I became quite interested in, and this was also part of my frustration, in why we were surprised by, or why the sort of typical vectors of inequality that we would use to describe this moment, race, racism, gender, class, didn't feel kind of, you know, we're on the one hand capturing things that are very powerful and profound about this moment, but on the other hand also felt inadequate. So I began to sort of think about other categories that we might use, and one of the things that's been, I think, a helpful way to think about it is that the conversation that we've been having around COVID-19 and racial health disparities really embodies like so many different layers of social categories and forms of causality about what cause health disparities, right? And so that our conversation really is pushing racial health disparities to its very limit. Like, you know, racial inequality is not the only driver there again and again. And so, but we use racial health disparities as a way to think about health insurance access or lack thereof, proximity to healthcare facilities, treatment of or mistreatment by physicians, access to COVID-19 testing, for this whole kind of edifice of structures and institutions. And we're really pushing the category, you know, the idea of racial health disparities kind of to its limits. And I think it's because, as important as racism and structural racism is to the story of what's happening in COVID-19 in American society, it's not the only story. And so I've been interested to think about what new social categories that are emerging might be useful for us to think through this moment, right? So some of this, you know, how do we want to begin to think about people who are being called the COVID so-called long haulers? You know, what would it sort of open up for us to think about that as a salient and powerful social category beyond, I think, how, you know, people in the world of kind of medical sociology and STS that I live in, beyond it being a kind of patient advocacy group, like what would it mean to take that as a serious and significant kind of social lived experience that might not be, you know, won't ever reach the kind of level of a demographic category that we use in the census, but is powerful and meaningful nevertheless. So to think through this a little bit, I've been thinking about the category of the essential worker. And I think here is where, again, we run up against our own thinking. So for many of us, the category of the essential worker has come to hold the place of you know, healthcare workers, people in care who do care work, almost, you know, disproportionately Black and brown women of color. And I think that's certainly true. But what we are missing, and that sort of comfortably fits into the narrative that we tell about society that's about racial inequality and gender discrimination and kind of intersectional forms of discrimination. And again, that's partly true. But there's also so much more in the category of essential workers that we're really kind of flattening, right? So essential workers is a social category that's mandated by law. Some of you will recall that on March 19th of this year, the US Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security issued a memorandum called a Memorandum on the Identification of Essential Critical Infrastructure Workers During the COVID-19 Response. So this was a memorandum because the federal government didn't have the ability to enact any of what it was recommending, but made recommendations that were then enacted in lots of different interesting ways by states. So as I want to suggest here, the essential worker category that gets flattened to working class Black and brown women workers, care workers, or the kind of traditional category of the working class, like, is actually insufficient for understanding what happened to labor and work during particularly the most strident periods of the lockdown. And so I want to sort of offer as an example in the state of Illinois, how a manifestation of this kind of federal guidance was that Governor Pritzker signed Executive Order number 8, which, quote, designated essential workers as a wide, excuse me, that's not a quote, this is me, that designated essential workers as a wide swath of people that cut across traditional kind of social categories, and also just, lay understandings of working class, of race, and the like. So this category of essential workers, I'm just going to read you a little bit from this Executive Order number 8, included the expected healthcare and public health operations workers. So hospitals, clinics, dental offices, pharmacies. This is Illinois in particular, so it might be different in jurisdictions that you're familiar with. Pharmaceutical companies, pharmacies, medical device and equipment companies, biotechnology companies, okay? In addition, it also included human services operations. So any Illinois state-funded human services institutions, anything, these are often nursing homes or community-based settings that provide services to elderly people, people with mental disabilities, and the like. So it provided services provided services for, so there are people who were supposed to work as essential workers in this place, but they were also, the world of essential work was services for particular communities, developmental centers, adoptees, shelters, other kinds of social services. So that kind of, I think, duality of the essential worker piece gets lost, that there were communities to whom the work was needed that were not just elite people sitting at home who wanted to have things delivered to them, but were really sort of vital services of infrastructure and social services that were necessary. So this executive order also included what was called essential infrastructure, food production, distribution, trash pickup, public transportation, recycling, also internet, video, and telecom systems, and the like. Things that you'll be familiar with, workers who worked at stores that sold groceries and medicine. In the state of Illinois, it also included cannabis production and agriculture, not only for medicinal purposes, but for adult purposes. A wide swath of IT, but also the media, the print media, internet companies, tech companies and the like, professional services companies, legal services, accounting services, insurance services, real estate services were all considered essential work. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that our typical kind of demographic way of thinking about social categories really sort of flattened out what it meant to be an essential worker. And of course, the experience of what it meant to be an essential worker for someone who worked in a knowledge industry and could do the work of legal services or media from home is different from others. But it's really important to capture a reclassification of work in society writ large that happens after the pandemic, and that has certainly disparate outcomes and different impacts on how it affects people's lives, but has created a whole new social category of people in the world that I think it behooves us to sort of pay attention to. Similarly, the idea of people with pre-existing conditions. So many people have pre-existing conditions, but we've allowed that to be really sort of flattened to African Americans, Latinx members, people in Latinx communities who are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. But the category of sort of living with pre-existing conditions is much broader still. And I think is for us another opportunity to think about how COVID did and did not act in the world. And I'm also increasingly interested, and I'm sure others have lots to say about this, in the sort of category of the clinical trial subject, the vaccine subject, and the sort of contrast on the one hand between the media presentation of clinical trial subjects for the vaccine, which happen to often be, youngish white males, who are, fully insured and quite brave, and deemed to be kind of brave and pioneering. Those words used deliberately, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of growing need that there needs to be a diverse pool of people in the vaccine trials, and how do you think about and access that? And of course, all of this against the backdrop of your colleague Jill Fisher's excellent book that came out in May, Adverse Events, which is about racial inequality and clinical trials, and literally the kind of corporeal extraction of people and of their very bodies. So lastly, let me just move on to the sort of third kind of category that I want us to think through. And I call this again the myth of solutionism, which is Mazurov, or we might think about tech solutionism is how it's more often called. And the sort of technological patchwork surveillance that sort of emerges. So I think that we've had a lot of really important conversation and really great scholarship around technology and surveillance, and and it's a rich and growing body of work. But I think that it's a lot more complicated, and that this pandemic is a moment for us to kind of think about why that's the case. And so patchwork surveillance is a riff off of Ed Yong's essay on the patchwork pandemic that he wrote in The Atlantic in May, one of a series of astonishingly wonderful, beautifully written and smart essays that I imagine he'll win many awards for. So in this instance, I want to talk about kind of the costs and benefits and trade-offs of having to engage in sort of forms of technological surveillance that are in a moment of emergency said to be necessitated by public health. So the sort of solutionism idea would tell us that there would be a particular COVID-19 inflection, and we definitely have seen that. We've seen that with this sort of sense that there's an app for this, right? Contact tracing, we've got a digital contact tracing app. So anything that you might imagine that we need to do to mitigate COVID-19, there is some sort of technological fix for that. But what we've seen and the way this played out is fairly complicated. So there have been explicit intentional technologies created for COVID-19, such as the Bluetooth API technology that Apple and Google came up with. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, the moment of society after pandemic has sort of opened up the possibility of turning all sorts of other technologies into public health technologies that were not intended to be those things. So on the one, and this is consistent with the wonderful work, Simone Brown's work, Dark Matters, on surveillance in Black communities, Ruha Benjamin's excellent work on race after technology, in which we might think about the ways in which lots of different technologies are being used for given any opportunity to surveil, are doing precisely that. On the other hand, though, I want to suggest that that there's also, in a moment of public health crisis, the sort of loss of access to technology. So I'm going to talk this through, that we've got to think through the trade-offs there. So the cost, benefits, and trade-offs of engaging in public health surveillance by either volition or compulsion vary for different kind of jurisdictions. And given the forms of inequality that have been exposed by COVID-19, there are really kind of frameworks, I think, required for thinking about these that are include tech solutionism and a kind of critique of that, but other things besides. So for example, if we know that there are disparate rates of coronavirus disease experience and death rates in communities of color, how do we think about the use of technologies? Should they be overcorrecting for the potential vulnerability to the disease, or overcorrecting for potential harms? In the face of this, there has not been sort of frameworks and I think healthy conversation. There has in fact been kind of forms of deregulation or of kind of looking the other way. So returning again to the state of Illinois, this is Executive Order 7, which is on telehealth services, right? And so we, which are, have been expanded, necessarily so, but include the use of smartphones and other devices for doing forms of medical treatment, including mental health treatment, substance use disorder treatment, psychiatry, regular healthcare, and the like. And so this has really been, heralded by some as a great success, a great equalizer. Those of you who work in medical sociology or public health related fields know that a lot of our telemedicine comes out of mass incarceration and of trying to reduce the cost of healthcare and for-profit jails and prisons in particular. We have already evidence from a kind of big cohort study in New York City that was recently published that effectively shows that, again, we should not be surprised that racial health disparities are being replicated in telemedicine. Some of it's about digital divide and access issues, but others it's about sort of mistrust, bandwidth, whether or not one wants to use a doctor in that way, whether or not one is at home alone in a space, do you live in, in a crowded space or a space that allows you to have the kind of privacy that one might have with a physician and the like. So that's been, quickly sort of rolled out. It's unlikely that it's going to be rolled back in full, the sort of quick deregulation that allowed this to happen. And it's not clear that it's good for vulnerable communities in particular. Then we've got the sort of technological creep of other kinds of technologies that are allowed to be used as healthcare technologies in the face of the pandemic. So geolocation data, data brokers, and location tracking forms that often already work with law enforcement, immigration agencies, and political campaigns are now being used in California and Colorado and other places to monitor adherence to lockdown and social distancing policies. At UC, at the University of California at San Francisco, they use smart thermometer data. We also know that Fitbit data and Google search data has been used to track kind of mobility and sort of anticipate outbreaks and the like. So on the one hand, and those are really, in some ways, the surveillance there are for the most, these are consumer technologies, these are, as we might say, first world problems. But the technological creep has other implications as well. So many of you might be familiar with Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality, that really helps us to see how social welfare services are increasingly automated and increasingly done in a way that really sort of exacerbate inequality. And this is done in part by generating administrative burdens, making it difficult for people to get access to the help that they need for things like healthcare and also for unemployment. And of course, we know, in the state of Florida, notoriously during this Corona time, that the state had already, before millions of people started needing unemployment in that state, had already been intentionally weakening the unemployment system for a decade prior in order to reduce taxes on employers. And so this is a kind of another side, the kind of administrative burden of the technological spread. And then we've got the work of legal scholars, Michelle Gilman and Rebecca Green, who write about the surveillance gap. And really, I think, force us to think anew about issues of technology and surveillance and inequality. And so they suggest to us, and this is a quote from them, quote, "Those who rely on public benefits must turn over personal information and submit to government surveillance far more routinely than wealthier citizens. These people include undocumented immigrants, day laborers, homeless persons, and people with felony conviction histories suffering collateral consequences of their convictions. Members of these groups often remain outside of mainstream data flows and institutional attachments necessary to flourish in American society. In short, having too much privacy technological privacy, and indeed can be as injurious as having too little. And a sort of case in point here, some of you might have followed in San Francisco, the use of smartphones to get access to COVID-19 testing to marginalized and under-resourced communities. And of course, members of these communities didn't have smartphones. So rather than, so patchwork surveillance, and I'll wrap up. So rather than apps for public health that are kind of posed against privacy or always deemed to be surveillant, which they always potentially are, we need to think about over surveillance, under surveillance, and how that is sort of, I think, triangulated with being underserved for sort of basic services increasingly, even as we want to critique solutionism. So a few things to wrap up. Society is inherently unequal, and it means that we don't have universal solutions, but it means that we also might need to reimagine what our foundational kind of starting points or assumptions about society are. That society is dynamic, that categories, social categories, demographic categories are dynamic, and that our analyses and engagement with them need to do so as well. That standard debates about technology and privacy in the context of COVID-19 are much more complex and bear kind of further scrutiny than I think are kind of standard theories about how we want to talk about them. So to wrap up, to take up the now common language of reopening, reopening schools, reopening our offices, this moment of society after pandemic affords us an opportunity to consider what life and research has gotten wrong and how to enact new practices around what we know too well, but often fail to want to recognize or look at clearly. This opening is also an opportunity to pose questions about the conditions of our work as scholars and as others in the world, and to ask what kind of society we want after this pandemic wave crests. And I think inherent in the question for scholars is the type of social research we will need to both understand and construct new ideas of renewed social communities. Can't hear you, Andy.
Thank you. The technological affordances of Zoom have not made it to me yet. Thank you for some really interesting ideas and an incredibly broad set of reference to bring into these questions about how we're to think about society in the wake of the pandemic. I was thinking early on as you were talking about the social kaleidoscope and the inadequacy of prevailing concepts of social life. Also about the sort of legal principle that big cases make bad law, and the question of if there are things that we are, and who knows who the we is right now, but if there are things that we as a society are likely to get terribly wrong because we learn lessons from this sort of great exception that is the pandemic moment.
Is that the
That's
question?
my first question for you.
Can you say it again?
Sure.
I thought you were just, I thought it was a preamble.
Oh, sorry.
I thought you were winding up to.
No, I was thinking about the sense that if big sort of world historical events can induce us to make decisions that are, that may be wrong, right? Because either we over or underreact, right? And this may fit with your under and over surveillance point toward the end of the talk, right? That if a big case like the pandemic might drive us to overreact or to underreact in other ways, do you think there are particular areas that we're likely to get particularly wrong because we are dealing with, the mother of all big cases?
Yeah, good question. I think the technology piece is what we'll get terribly wrong, actually. I would offer that the getting the sort of racial progress myth piece, we've been getting that wrong all along, and so I think that the stakes of that are a little bit different from the technological piece. I mean, what is really worrisome in the technological space is the wide expanse of all sorts of technologies being deployed as health technologies, and because one can make that justification, the sort of threadbare constraint that one can have on technological surveillance kind of totally disappearing because of the sort of conditions, the social conditions. You know, the political scientist Adam Pozorski had this, wrote a couple of essays about COVID-19, and one of the things that he said in one of his essays was that societies, and he was talking about governments in particular as a political scientist, don't necessarily use what they've learned during an emergency after an emergency, but they don't forget it, right? So that there's so that it doesn't actually go away, and so that even if things in Executive Order 7 or 9 from the state of Illinois are rolled back, then that the sort of possibility of these things being doable and available as forms of surveillance and governance are already there. So those, I think, are the most concerning.
Interesting, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question and then let the assembled folks weigh in as well. And this goes back to your point about the myth of racial progress and the ways that 2020 as a temporal moment has exploded that sense. It strikes me that traditional theories of social movements aren't doing so well this year, right? That if we think about ideas like the opportunity structure, we ought not have seen the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter protests, nor even more impressively, the impact on public opinion that resurgence has caused. And that furthermore, the theories of public opinion that think about attention space, think about the election year as kind of a particular distinct moment, also should have told us that wouldn't happen. I'm intrigued by the confluence in 2020 of the pandemic and certainly the most, I think my colleague Andy Andrews, who works in social movements, has called it the largest social movement wave in the history of the country. Mm-hmm. I can't verify that separately, but at least it's a remarkably large, remarkably effective social movement wave in the context of a never before seen pandemic, in the context of an incredibly heightened political awareness around the election year, all of which is very surprising from a sort of traditional social movements angle. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about why that's surprising, or ways that we might rethink that, given you're thinking about the myth of racial progress.
I love that question. I mean, it's a category I've been trying to think about around social movements and our sort of inadequacies. And I would first recommend to everyone Dana Fisher's book American Resistance, who she's got this incredible methodology and is really out in the field now, also trying to track and get data from participants in the movement for Black Lives. So there's some new data and I think some new theorizing, but movement, a lot of good social movement research, because we want to rely on things like opportunity structures. And I think that will always be true. I mean, if we want to convert that for non-sociologists, I mean, we talk in the language of incentives all the time. So there's always incentive structures that make people more or less likely to take an action or not. Certainly in the sort of COVID-19 context, if you don't have a job to go to, right? Like that's a sort of opportunity structure potentially to engage in social movement activity. Similarly, we know, and during the sort of modern civil rights movement, that you know, young people and were, you know, maybe less likely to be incarcerated as a result of their activities, so we're more likely to perhaps engage in social movement activity. But I think that's really a perfect example. I mean, I think that who probably of the sort of big sociology theorists of social movements, who gets it closest to right is probably Alden Morris, because he understands that social movements are about kind of history of, you know, I did an essay, a short piece in the American Journal of Public Health called The Long Durée of Black Lives Matter, which is really about what I call in my book Body and Soul, the kind of long medical civil rights movement. So this kind of long struggle that goes on. And so I think one must understand the movement for Black lives as being part of this longer struggle for Black freedom. And in that context, it makes perfect sense. It also makes perfect sense in the context of intergenerational struggle in Black-centered and Black-led movements. So recall, you know, we had during the modern civil rights movement, the young people in SNCC sort of not, you know, always so happy with the older preachers and ministers and how they wanted to run social movements and the kind of politics of respectability. And so, you know, I think that we have a turn here where people want to, I think, inspired by Black feminism, have an organizational structure that is not sort of, you know, thinking of Erica Edwards' book on charisma and Black leadership, that's not led by this, you know, Black male charismatic leader that's, you know, heteronormative and that. So I think that I think that there's probably some space in some of the social movement literature that gets it right, but I think fundamentally we really wanted to be able to be kind of predictive and you know, able to sort of track movements over time. And I think the approach that we use often in the social movements literature and sociology certainly didn't do that. And then I think the public opinion, you know, so I agree with you that the public opinion piece is interesting in this moment, particularly given that we know, for example, that there was a low public opinion of Dr. King, that there had been a low public opinion and an earlier iteration of the movement for Black lives. But I think it was the sort of infrastructure all around to deal with with COVID-19, I think made people really, I think, aware of kind of structural inequality in a different way, and I think primed folks for to really sort of listen. Not to mention the fact that you were stuck in your house, sheltering in place. Many of us who had the privilege of doing that. So I think all of these things, as you were suggesting, Andy, kind of created a perfect storm that certainly could not have been anticipated in the literature, even if a few other things could have been.
Thank you for that. And again, thank you for this great discussion and presentation. I'm going to open it now to the folks who've joined us on the call. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please either raise your hand. My computer is glitching here, but please either raise your hand or post the request in the chat, and we'll open it for the conversation. My computer keeps going in and out here, but Janet Renee Kennedy, please join us.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find the button. So first off, thank you, Dr. Nelson. When you came to Pitt a few years ago, I was an engineering student and I had a lot of questions about race and technology. And like, this is my first year in a sociology PhD program. So like a lot of the questions I had and the thinking I kind of started kind of have led me to this point. And I think being exposed to scholars like you were really helpful. So I just wanted to say that first. But my question is, because I'm coming from a tech background, but also like the identity of being a Black woman, I kind of see like you mentioned before the problems where tech tends to exacerbate like what's happening as opposed to kind of helping these problems in different ways. So I guess as tech is trying to like rush to make solutions to COVID-19, as we see with like, I mean, even the curriculum, how things are changing, but they're also starting to have these conversations about race because students are kind of forcing them to become more aware. I'm like worried that they want to solve race and solve the pandemic. So what do you think, like what is like good and positive conversation that kind of leads tech to kind of like start acknowledging race without just going to the extreme end of saying like, we're gonna solve this without understanding like anything about like the societal consequences of it?
Oh gosh, what a great and rich question, Janet, and good to be reunited here, and congrats on starting your doctoral program. It's fantastic. So I think, gosh, there's so many answers. So tech doesn't want to solve the race problem. So I guess for me, you know, I just want to be, I guess part of my impatience with this moment is just not like, you know, let's just be real, right? And so tech is in a lot of ways like big tobacco in the 1990s, like, you know, polluting big industrial corporations in the 1930s. You know, they don't want to fix the race problem, I think, and they can't. You know, it's an issue of politics. They can certainly help, right? So that tech could certainly be a better ally. And you know, if we think about how so much of sort of polarization around racism, in particular in the United States, has, as you know, we're getting increasing evidence, has been fomented by disinformation in a lot of the social media spaces coming from all sorts of actors. You know, one could have certainly a meaningful and more kind of robust response to that, and to feel that one has a moral obligation as an organization to do something about that. And then I would say, you know, if you haven't read Simone Brown's work, have you read Dark Matters? Oh, you've got to get it. I'll send it to you. Email me your address, I'll send it to you. But you know, part of what she also tracks, so she starts with slave patrols. I mean, she starts about early technologies of surveillance and comes up into the contemporary moment. And she reminds us, this is related to Professor Perrin's question, that there was always the inverse of this, which was surveillance, right? So that there were always sort of ways in which communities were trying to work around technology. I think the space of agency and activism is getting smaller. And I think that there are, you know, it's this kind of chessboard in which one might, you know, you can think about the incredible demonstrations in Hong Kong and the ways that people were using masking and sort of, you know, I don't know if you saw some of the videos of people taking their hair and braiding it around their face and doing all sorts of things to sort of get around the facial recognition technology. So I think that kind of like cat and mouse game will continue to be played out. But I think fundamentally, you know, if the orientation of large multinational corporations is not one that is oriented toward racial liberation, and you know, we need to not expect it to be that space. And I think this is here where I think about you know, some of Fred Turner's work. We still, and this is a little bit goes to my point, Janet, about our own kind of willful ignorance. So we also have a willful ignorance around Silicon Valley, which is that it starts out of the, you know, hippie subculture, and then there's you know, there's a whole kind of narrative. And we want to hang on to it still being this like place of kind of radical freedom and possibility. Because it comes out of that particular subcultural genealogy. And it's been telling us for a long time that it's not that place anymore, even if it ever was. And so, you know, that we need to understand that, you know, it's like IBM or, you know, Chevron Oil in 1935. I mean, you know, and stop, I think, kind of mythologizing and, you know, what technology is, which are large multinational corporations.
Great question.
But I'll send you Simone's book, so do send me your address.
Great question and really interesting conversation. Other folks who'd like to make comments or ask questions, please go ahead.
This is Dawn Hunter here. I'm just wondering, I really appreciate the conversation, and I found this really just engaging. And I do some work around messaging in public health. And so I'm just curious about like your thoughts on how do we take these concepts that you articulated here and share them with a broader audience in a way that's actionable? Because I feel like this is great information, but it shouldn't be restricted to people, like me, who are like, I'm going to spend my afternoon or early evening, on this call. But how do we get that information out there more broadly?
So what information about kind of racial, sort of like the myth of racial progress and these sorts of things, or?
Yeah. How do we inform, like, for that specifically, the myth of racial progress, but also just if, we are going to see evolving social categories, and we are going to see, we have to come up with a new norm for post-pandemic life and shaping the conversations around what that looks like, while also still trying to navigate the world that we're currently experiencing. And that's tricky to do. But, I think that some of what you talked about is just, all of what you talked about is really interesting, but I think it's probably things that most people just most people don't think about. So for example, like I've read Automating Inequality and I loved it, and I tell people about it and they're like, what? I've never heard of that book. And I'm like, oh, everybody has to read this, and it's short and it's great. And, just being able to put that information out there and make it more accessible to really help inform conversations, but also action.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that question and for pushing on that. I really believe, the reason that I'm at the SSRC is that I actually really do believe in the power of scholarship. And so part of it is, I would say to myself, fix yourself first, right? That people that scholarship can resonate and does resonate. But if we are doing it wrong because we're caught in the same kind of mythology that everyone else is caught up in, that's not going to sort of help transform narratives and the like. And, I actually think, I'm so grateful for your question. One of the things I think that's really interesting about this moment is because there have been, Ruha Benjamin is sort of particularly good at this, but there's some people who are particularly great at the work of translation. Many scholars are not, but some are. And, I think the ones that are being really impactful. So people who worked with, Nicole Hannah-Jones on 1619. A lot of what we are fighting about right now is the work of scholars and the impact it's having in the world. If you look, for example, at the Black Lives Matter kind of manifesto, of a couple of years ago, it is rich with African-American studies, ethnic studies scholarship, fantastic scholarship on kind of liberation and pedagogy and that kind of enlightenment. And so I don't think our work goes everywhere, but I think it goes a lot of places. And then, I think they're the sort of the things that are working increasingly, like scholars writing for, writing op-eds, finding, the wonderful spaces like the Washington Post has both the Made by History and the Monkey Cage, which are, endeavoring to get, on the one hand, historians or people who do historical work, and on the other hand, political science and political science adjacent work out sort of disseminated in the wider public. So I think that kind of work matters. And I also think, because you say that you're coming from a health background, what I think that we don't need to do is dumb things down. So one of my lessons from doing research on the Black Panther Party's health activism was, and then sort of thinking about what that might look like today. So, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Black Panther Party does effectively a public health campaign around sickle cell anemia disease to raise public awareness about it. So they use their newspaper, their broadside, to educate the public in local communities in which they were members of about sickle cell anemia. And the sort of striking thing for me there was that they put cell pathology photographs, that they put pedigree charts about how the disease was transferred. So you deal with health information. I can't tell you what the uptake of that was, but we know that people who were close to their community thought that their communities could understand it that way. And I'll often say in other settings that if we imagine a public health campaign now for sickle cell anemia, you can imagine someone feeling like they have to do an animation and sort of, make it kind of that it couldn't be sort of giving people kind of serious public health information. So you are the messaging expert in health, so I don't know that, but I also would say that dissemination doesn't have to always come with not understanding their different literacy rates and the like, but not understanding that people can't understand. And I think what I so appreciate about Ruha's work is that she's taken the most kind of black boxed, obscure things in the world and use narrative structures to sort of disseminate them to people such that they kind of get it and understand. And certainly more of that can be done, but it may not be the work for all scholars.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Other folks who'd like to join in with questions, thoughts, comments, please either post in the chat or join us.
Dr. Nelson, my name is Kathy Jameson. I was only able to come in at the tail end, and I just want to say I so appreciate your work and the ways that you take it up. Even just your responses to these questions they're humane, and they're also in defense of intellectualism, which we need in this moment so much. So thank you very much for that. I actually have to run because I'm doing Scholar Strike today, and I'm starting my own series of things today with students at Sac State. But I want to ask you if you will please, you're probably doing this already, but will you please, I'm in kinesiology, will you please think about the wobble and think about surveillance and this notion of reopening that I caught at the tail end of your talk, and really think about what's it going to look like when the season's over and they come out of the wobble, the WNBA for folks who aren't following women's basketball. There's a real commitment there and a real investment. Actually, they've given in to some surveillance in order to be able to participate in that way, and then to participate in the movement in a way that we haven't seen before. So I would really appreciate your intellect being brought to that in some public ways. I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes. If you have some thoughts today, I'd be happy to hear them, but I'd love to see you write about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, your kind words and the question. It brings me to Kathy, to thinking about the work that I've done on African Americans using direct-to-consumer genetics, which, I went into the project thinking, why would particularly African American senior citizens who've, seen some things, been around, sort of use this technology, know that it's potentially dangerous, know that it has this kind of eugenicist frisson that it carries with it. And, why would they do it? And I think much like the athletes in the wobble that, this, and I'm thinking a little bit of the kind of literature on risk culture, that particular people in marginalized communities are left to make these constant risk assessments. And it's this constant trade-off, right? So if you are from a marginalized community, you already accept as a given that you're going to be surveilled. So it's a matter of, can I be surveilled on my own terms? Do I want to be surveilled today? Under what surveillance is okay because it might help me to accomplish something else. And I think that's always happening. And so, and I really believe in, listening to what people say about their lives. I mean, it's why, even when I did the Black Panther historical book, it was very much driven by interviews and really just spending time with people. And so what these early genetic genealogists would say to me would say, I know about Tuskegee. I know that this might end up in the hands of, law enforcement. But I also know that I want to know what this genetic inference is, even if, the science is not as great as I thought it should be, or, is never going to be as great as it should be, because you know, I'm making a choice. And, you know, that's the kind of choice and consumption thing we can certainly critique as being very neoliberal, very much about African Americans in the United States who are relatively wealthy relative to, you know, who have the choice to kind of make this choice. But it also, what it really taught me was that every day people are making these kinds of calculations, you know, and that we don't give them enough credit for doing it. And that, you know, a decision that someone might make on Tuesday might change on Thursday in a different context around the issue of surveillance, because it is, you know, going back again to Simone Brown's work, the sort of constant of Black life in some ways.
Thank you so much. And I still hope you write on that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to run. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you. Gail Henderson writes in the chat, she says, I'm really interested in the ways that new social positions are being created, like essential workers, but also including positions defined by health and risk for COVID-19, like people with underlying conditions, old people, giving a new way to talk about risk factors. I'm going to just add to that as well. I'm interested in all those that you've identified, but also the one that you mentioned about the status of the test subject for vaccines, right? And the question about the accumulation of risk and what one is to do as a vaccine test subject. Gail, do you want to join in with any additional piece of that question?
I guess the one thing, hi, so
Hi.
I'm Gail
Yeah,
Henderson.
I know your work well. Good to see you.
Oh, is that so nice to hear? Wow. Well, you've completely won me over if you hadn't already by your talk, which you did. And Jill Fisher, I'm in the department with Jill Fisher,
Yeah.
and I texted her immediately. Guess what? Because she was so thrilled to hear you had mentioned her book. That's not why I unmuted myself, but it was a wonderful talk. And so I guess the question, the whole thing about a pandemic creating new social position categories, that's brilliant. And also, I have to say, the whole thing about old people, to me, besides race, ethnicity, underlying conditions, being able to talk about risk factors in a way that's somehow you're not whispering about, oh, is this just, you know, we don't want to mention it, but you know, if you're this and that, you're at higher. But if you're old, it's like crazy how that whole life of being a certain age in America got completely transformed. And I just find that you just like gave me words to think about it. But also, how long do you think this is going to? Do you think this is really transformative, or do you think it's going to ebb? You know, after a vaccine comes out, and you know, and so on. Treatment.
I haven't, you know, on the last one, who knows? I mean, no idea. And also, I think all the theories about what particular vaccine acts on what thing. So is it like stopping you from getting the disease, or is it preventing, you know, like all of the different kind of pathways that the different vaccines they're all different theories. So, you know, I think we've got some ways to go. I mean, I do think that there's an increasing, I was looking at some images this morning from the rally that President Trump did yesterday. I mean, there's just this increasing tolerance, you know, there is, you know, people just like think it's okay to be sick, you know, or, you know, to risk it. And so I think that will increase as there's a kind of impatience with the kind of mitigating behaviors that we should all be participating in right now. I love that you raised the question of elderly people, because it was one of the, I've been thinking about it since the very beginning. In part, I mean, I've been thinking about it certainly in the case of Sweden, where a society effectively decided that we are going to let thousands of old people die. I mean, just thousands. And we have a kind of, again, this is about sort of myth and reality that I think is sort of like burst open by the pandemic. So we have this sort of, respect, tend to honor old people, but, we warehouse them away, and that the pandemic really led to the kind of revelation of how many kind of elderly people were, effectively warehoused in institutional spaces, some for completely necessary reasons. I mean, but so age is interesting to me, both because then the split screen, Gail, is the very young, right? So there's a kind of doubling down on both sides of what it means for old people and what it means for young people. Yeah. And what's been fascinating has been like an inability in the most instances, or an unwillingness to make modifications to public health practice or advice based on the sort of understanding that age really matters. So to the extent it's been a lack of action, like, it doesn't matter for young people, so it doesn't matter. But there hasn't been, it really matters for old people, let's overcompensate, right? Let's sort of do the sort of, what would be the comparable reaction to doing nothing for young people, which is not a good reaction at all. But if that is a sort of logical reaction, then the sort of the opposite of that should be like, let's overreact to overcompensate for, resources and protection of old people. So I've actually also found this very interesting. I think, because I live in New York City mostly, I think about communities of color that have very particular, ways of, in particular, that, more often to live intergenerationally, to really, as an African American, there is a kind of, there are cultural norms around how you treat elders, how you talk to elders, how you, and that's true. And so it's also a kind of violence to, I think, the way that particular communities think about elders. So some of the recategorization is making them a risk category as opposed to a treasured category or a venerable category, because people couldn't go to the homes, couldn't, So I think the age piece is really, really important.
And it just, the notion that everything about this lays bare what we already knew about society in terms of inequality. But the notion that the majority of people who have died have been in nursing homes, that's just, that all by itself, you sort of, it's one of those statistics you just can barely take in, because what does that mean about where old people are living? Right. So well, thank you. But also, Andy at the very end asked something which I'm also quite interested in. And that is something that you mentioned in your talk about participants in vaccine trials. And I don't know, maybe Andy, maybe you want to read.
Well, I can say something, and maybe Andy, you can say something back. So I think one of the, and this is just going from really the early days when the trials were just getting started, and me watching too much television, like probably many of you. So correct me if you saw something different, but the interviews that I saw with the early phase 1 clinical subjects were, to a person, I think all sort of 28 to 34-year-old, probably heterosexual white men. And I found it fascinating because, so much of the literature in the history of medicine and medical sociology, public health is really about, certainly after the 1970s, is sort of getting away from the sort of single male subject as being the sort of locus of clinical research and of diagnostic anything, And so to see that sort of played out on television in 2020 in these interviews was absolutely fascinating. And then I think any of us who work in this space could have certainly predicted that someone was going to go like, oh, do we need diversity in the clinical trials? Because we constantly need diversity in the clinical trials. I mean, it's a major writ large problem. And part of what is, I mean, Jill Fisher, that book could not have come out at a better time. And she was not certainly writing for the COVID moment, but I think is such a critical and necessary backdrop. And this is a book about effectively I don't know if she'd call it this, but the political economy of clinical trials. And who are the people who are so you know, desperate, destitute, sort of atomized in their community, you know, that they will go, for whom it's okay to go and spend 2 months in a bunker, you know, and have people do things to you. And it's just really, and, you know, so many of them are African-American men, some, you know, formerly incarcerated, down on their luck, homeless, and the like. It's a chilling account, but it's the more true account than when we're seeing on CNN of the, you know, the brave person that's going to throw themselves into phase one, you know, because in the other, you know, one of the other takeaways from the Fisher book, of course, is that folks aren't giving medical care for any of the adverse events. So if something happens to you in the course of it, and they say it's not related to the therapy or intervention that they're doing, then, you know, so the sort of being able to take the risk of these, you know, kind of middle-class young men who we appreciate, that we see on television, is in part because they likely have healthcare benefits that, should there be an adverse event, that would allow them to sort of deal with it in ways that others cannot. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's that's all I have to say about it. I'd love to hear what Andy has to say. I'm still thinking it through.
I know it. Andy.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not entirely sure what more I had to say. One thing is that I'm always impressed with Alondra is that she's actually read everything and can recall it all. It's really remarkable from the talk, given that I literally this weekend managed to finish reading my journals that are dated 2017. But I was actually thinking, Gail, about some of your work when I raised the question, and the idea, you know, of your discussion, I think a number of years ago, about how research subjects understand the concept of benefit when there isn't likely to be any individual benefit. But I was thinking about it also more in terms of, I guess, of these phase 3 trials now, where we have all this kind of latent information, or information about latent risk that you know, that we can identify as so-called risk factors, and then we're asking, or large numbers of subjects are being asked to submit to either a vaccine trial or a placebo, and then the question is, how do we the question for me is, how do we understand the risk that they are being exposed to when there's also a whole set of behavioral interventions that everyone is supposed to be submitting to, right? So if the behavioral interventions work, then the phase 3 trials don't, or they don't work as well. And it's all a sort of a function of kind of unobservable risk, it seems to me. So that's how I was thinking about it and where my question was coming from.
Well, you need people in those trials who are at heightened risk, or you won't, or if you're gonna, I'm gonna let Alondra have the final word here, but you're not gonna have any results unless you recruit high risk people for both arms, for all those trials. It is a bit of a conundrum. So Alondra.
Yeah, no, I don't. The only other thing I would have found interesting about this is the high risk people, but also that you need people to kind of be out in the world. So they can't be in bunkers. Like, you actually need them to be circulating so they can potentially contract the virus. So yeah, that also makes this, you know, you know, and I think for those who are maybe online with us here who are not academics, but like sort of sociologically, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, at all the levels, like the recruitment level, the sense that your point about how do you kind of control or sort of manage the behavior such that you can have a reliable experiment, but also need people to be sort of out and about, not at home. You know, it's fascinating.
Other folks who'd like to join the conversation, please post in the chat or just jump in.
I just want to thank Alondra again. It is 6 or after 6, but thank you. It's so very nice to meet you. I hope I can see you again.
Same. Okay, bye-bye.
So if there are no more questions, and it does look like we've lost a large proportion of our participants as well. So I will say, Alondra, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation and really, really interesting ideas. We will be posting the video to the IAH website, so those of you who are on can see the rest of it. And we'll also be coming up with a new batch of Zoom talks in the coming months, and so please watch this space. Meanwhile, again, let me thank the wonderful IAH staff for their tremendous work. Ebony Johnson, Ava Lane, Sophia Ramos, and Tommy Watson have all been a big piece of this. And once more, a tremendous thank you to Alondra Nelson for her time and really fascinating ideas. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. And I want to say hi to my cousin is here. So hi, nice to see you here, Jackie. Thanks for being here. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.